from the world of politics.
What it does is finally puts in place something that I've worked on for a long time, which is an alternative minimum tax for our very largest corporations. You got to pay at least 15%. And it also closes much of the carried interest loophole.
To the world of business.
I think the Fed has a unique opportunity right now to kind of experiment with a higher target inflation level as it's coming down from the very high current levels toward whatever the new target's going to be.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, a series of 5 states had elections yesterday. Most of those were for primaries looking toward the November midterms, and we'll come back and cover those later in this program. But first, we want to start with a proposed amendment to the Kansas Constitution that caught everyone a bit by surprise, I think. And for a report on that, we turn now to Washington correspondent Joe Matthew, host of Sound On, weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, at least I was surprised when I heard it this morning.
Well, that's right. It's getting a lot of attention here, David, because, well, first of all, a lot of people thought this was going to pass, and because it's Kansas. This is the first opportunity that voters have had to weigh in on the issue of abortion since the Supreme Court ruled on Roe v. Wade. And in Kansas, Democrats make up just about 26% of the electorate. Republicans make up 44%. So again, many thought this would pass. It did not. It failed by some 20 points, as you can see here, and turnout was a big part of the story. Surprisingly strong, David, almost twice the number of people voting in this election than did so in the 2018 primaries. And so it raises some questions. Is Kansas, in fact, the bellwether for the nation, as many analysts are suggesting this morning, or is this a story about effective campaigning and organizing in Kansas? Pro-choice activists, who you can see here celebrating, spent weeks knocking on doors, writing postcards, sending out mailers to get out the vote, and it appeared to work. The question is, can that be duplicated in other parts of the country? The head of a group called Kansas for Constitutional Freedom calls this an historic day for Kansas and for America. David, it might take some time before we learn if the latter part of that statement is true.
Yeah, exactly. There may be some Republicans taking out their pencils and sharpening this morning for those
Indeed.
midterms. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. You can catch him this afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio, on Sound On. And now we want to turn from the subject of abortion and state constitutions to the subject of the economy in the United States, but also globally for that matter. And to get an insight on that, we turn now to Raghuram Rajan. He is Chicago Booth School Professor of Finance, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So welcome, Professor. Good to have you here. We do spend a lot of time trying to figure out the U.S. economy. And I'm curious about your perception, particularly right now, about where the Fed is and where it needs to go in order to really get inflation under control.
Well, it's on its way. The economy is slowing. You're seeing some signs. Housing, for example, is already slowing. You're seeing yesterday in the JOLTS report on jobs available, that came down somewhat. And of course, we're waiting to see the employment report at the end of the week. But I think the slowing is underway. The question is, can the Fed manage a soft landing? And that's where there's a lot of difference in opinion. Some people say it'll have to engineer a real recession in order to get inflation down to the levels it would be satisfied with. Others suggest that even if it doesn't want a recession, that's the outcome, because slowing has a momentum of its own and it'll go in that direction. My sense is we still have some possibility that, yes, we will get what looks like relatively slow times, but hopefully it will be mild. Now, a lot depends on the labor market and whether it can be slowed down gently.
So one of the critical issues on this is the Fed and what it does in raising rates. And there's a question here about the so-called neutral rate, because it's thought in general we need to get to restrictive beyond neutral. As you know, Fed Chair Jay Powell last week suggested we may already be at neutral, but now there seems to be some dissension, including we heard this from St. Louis Fed President James Bullard just today, saying that we need to go further to get to restrictive levels. This was on CNBC.
We've still got some ways to go here to get to restrictive monetary policy. I've argued that now with the hotter inflation numbers in the spring, we should get to 3.75 to 4% this year.
So the question, as I understand it, not being an economist, is can you be at neutral at 2 to 2.5% when you've got inflation at such a high rate? We had Larry Summers on last Friday saying that just analytically doesn't make sense. What's your view?
I don't think Chairman Powell said this was a point to stop. I think he said in the longer run, once we've got inflation back under control, this is about the level we will be at. That's the neutral rate. But certainly at this stage, he indicated, and I don't know how the market misinterpreted this to be something like his saying that we should stop. He basically indicated there would be a substantial number of rate hikes going forward. And I think he's probably not where Mr. Bullard is, but certainly by the end of the year, 3.5 is where the Fed would like to be. And it certainly will see whether the economy seems to be slowing. Inflation will probably come down because fuel price increases have ameliorated. Commodity prices are starting to come down. And they will see if there's momentum in the direction that they anticipate, and then decide whether they should pause or go further forward. I doubt that the economy will drop enough, inflation will drop enough for them to be satisfied at that point that it's time to cut rates. And certainly they will go beyond the current 2.5, wherever it is.
Professor, as you know so well, the Fed does not operate in a vacuum. What it does can affect central banks and economies around the world. Give us your perception on what's going on with emerging markets right now. Normally, if the Fed were tightening, we would think that would be quite difficult for emerging markets. We have Sri Lanka, which right now seems to be an outlier. How is the rest of emerging markets, particularly in Asia, how are they doing?
They typically have high inflation, probably largely driven by fuel and food. Now, of course, some of that is coming off, but many of them have been raising rates in anticipation way before the Fed. Brazil is at double-digit interest rates. So they have anticipated what needs to happen. We've seen some outflows of capital. That's one of the effects of Fed tightening, that capital starts flowing back to industrial countries. But so far, it has been somewhat limited. It hasn't been the tremendous outflows that we saw, for example, during the taper tantrum in 2013. So the hope is, yes, there will be a number of developing countries and emerging markets which have serious problems with food and fuel for their people. Sri Lanka is the first example. Pakistan is in some amount of trouble. A number of countries in Africa are in deep trouble. Madagascar seems to be suffering a famine. So yes, there are problems around the world, but it's not a generalized emerging market crisis as yet. Of course, there is a level of interest rates that the Fed can go to, which could precipitate more of a crisis, but certainly at this point, that is not the anticipated level.
And what about India? You were the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. They have their own challenges with the rupee being fairly low at the same time inflation is high. You, when you were governor, really put inflation #1 as your goal. What should be the goal of the Reserve Bank of India right now?
Well, I'm going to say inflation once more. The point is that if you focus on getting inflation under control, the exchange rate finds the appropriate level. Now, there's a lot of worry in India because people look at the rupee versus the dollar. Many middle-class parents have their kids in school in the United States. They worry about tuition fees going through the roof if the rupee depreciates against the dollar. But truth be told, the dollar is very strong and has appreciated against many currencies, including the euro. And in real effective exchange rate terms, that is measured against all currencies, the rupee is not that depreciated. It's pretty level. So the reality is the dollar is strong rather than the rupee is weak. That said, I think the central bank should focus on inflation and get that under control. Everything else follows.
Okay, Professor, always such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Raghuram Rajan of the Chicago Booth School. Coming up, Republican Senator Rick Scott on the reconciliation package on a path to a possible Senate vote this weekend. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton with the first word.
David, thank you very much. President Biden is still testing positive for COVID-19. His doctors say he does not have a fever and has an occasional cough. They say he is in good spirits and continues to feel well. The president will continue to isolate at the White House. OPEC Plus members have agreed on an increase in oil production for September, but it's the smallest in its history, 100,000 barrels a day. This comes after President Biden took a political gamble with his visit to Saudi Arabia and asked for more oil to be pumped. Nancy Pelosi has reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. The House Speaker ended her visit there today after pledging the U.S. would not abandon its commitment to the democratically elected government. China reacted to the Speaker's trip by announcing a series of military exercises. Beijing also imposed trade sanctions on Taiwan. Britain's governing Conservative Party is delaying sending out ballots for the party's leadership election after a warning from the UK intelligence services about the risk of fraud. Party members will now get a unique code that allows one unchangeable vote. Tory members are choosing between Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and former Treasury Chief Rishi Sunak to replace Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who resigned in July. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, it may be August, but the Senate is very much still in session with, it seems like, almost a piece of legislation coming out of there every single day. One that's still pending is that reconciliation package. It involves spending as well as some increased taxes that they're trying to get through, perhaps voting on it as soon as this weekend. To give us the Republican point of view on this package, we now turn to Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida. So, Senator, thanks so much for being back with us. There are reports that it could get voted on as early as this weekend. Is that consistent with what you understand?
Yeah, we don't know exactly when. We haven't seen the final text. It's been going on since I've been up here. I've been up here 3.5 years. Is we get a monster bill, and then they expect us to vote on it within hours. And how can you read it, and how can you talk to your constituents and get all their concerns? But here's my concern about this bill: the seniors in my state and people on poor families in my state are really struggling with this inflation. Gas prices are up, food prices are up. Housing prices are up, rent's up, everything sort of is up. You take somebody on fixed income, and we have a lot of seniors. They don't have money for these things, so they're going back to work. They're delaying their retirement, and now with this package, they're there's going to increase the tax burden on every income level in the country. That's according to the Joint Commission on Taxation. There's going to be more gas taxes. I mean, it's hard to believe with gas prices where they are. They want to have a gas price increase, and then on top of that, they're going to do a $280 billion cut in Medicare, which is ultimately going to result in fewer life-saving drugs. So this is just a war on seniors. I've asked for a committee meeting. I'm on the Aging Committee to really go through why the Democrats have this war on our seniors right now, and we've got to deal with these.
So let's take a couple of those separately if we could. First of all, the increased taxes, as I understand it in the proposal that I've read about at least, it doesn't actually increase the taxes directly on individuals at all. Is what you're saying is because there will be increased taxes for some corporations currently not paying any tax, that will affect people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I saw a study that it's estimated that it'll be 218,000 people will lose their job. When you lose your job, I mean, that's really, think about how bad that is. But think about it, companies don't pay taxes, they pass it on. Either you'll pay for it as a consumer, or they'll hire fewer people, they spend less money for research, less money for investments. All it does is hurt their economy. There's never tax increases that improve our economic outlook, and we're in the middle of a recession. We've had 2 quarters of negative GDP. Our number of people on unemployment claims are starting to go up. I mean, this is a tough time for our country. I don't think you should ever raise taxes, but gosh, right now, when people already have this, record inflation, and this is just reckless spending that keeps happening up here. The Democrats keep spending money, like you said, David, every week. Last week it was $280 billion. Now this is, $750 billion tax increase and a $280 billion reduction in spending on Medicare. I don't know how that's good for seniors.
Yeah, and so one of the things that really strikes me is you're increasing taxes, but you're increasing taxes when it comes to corporations who are paying zero now. I mean, we have 55 major corporations paying zero money in taxes. Doesn't it strike your constituents back in Florida that seems kind of unfair?
Well, if they're not paying taxes, either they're not making money or they're getting write-offs for investments, things like that. So do we want these companies to continue to invest in our country? Do we want more jobs in this country? Do we want more manufacturing in the country? I think we do. So we've set up our tax policy to get those things, and now they're saying even with those things, we want to attack people for not paying taxes. And by the way, just always remember, companies are not going to pay this. This is going to be passed on. It's going to be fewer jobs, lower wages, or whoever buys their product is going to pay more for it. I mean, it gets passed through to consumer, and the Joint Commission on Taxation says every income bracket in this country is going to see a tax burden increase.
This is an inside the Beltway question, but I just have to ask you, Mitch McConnell is one of the most astute politicians I've ever seen, your majority leader. He said he would not let the CHIPS Act go through unless they abandoned the reconciliation. They let the act go through, and then they came back to reconciliation. Did he make a mistake?
Well, I think Republicans were duped. I think a lot of Republicans relied on what Joe Manchin was saying, that basically he was not going to go forward with anything, and he waited until 3 hours after the CHIPS Act was passed. And I, as you know, I've been probably the biggest opponent to the CHIPS Act because there's no accountability. I want to compete with China, but like a company like Intel is going to get $4 billion to build something. They don't have to build. They can build whatever type of chips they want. On top of that, we're going to give them a $4 billion write-off, and then we're going to give them a $1 billion tax credit, and they can keep expanding in China. And when China invades Taiwan, they can just keep doing business like it is. I'm a business guy. I got return on investment. There's no return for the taxpayers in that bill. So $280 billion last week, $750 billion increase this week, $400-some billion of additional spending. It's not money we got. I mean, the country doesn't have money in savings. We got $30 trillion worth of debt. This is going to cause more inflation.
Senator, let me wrap up with a political question, if I could. I know you're in charge of the Republican senator campaign effort there. We had a vote out of Kansas that some of us at least were surprised by yesterday, refusing to change the Kansas Constitution by a pretty good margin. And this is in a sort of an off year, thought the turnout would be low. Turnout was pretty high, as I understand it. Does that suggest for Republicans like you that actually abortion may be a bigger issue in the midterms than you thought?
Well, I think where the country is the country is pro-life. The country is for reasonable restrictions and reasonable exceptions, and they're not where the Democrats are, where they've said they've all voted to say you can have abortion up to the moment of birth. Baby doesn't have to be kept alive. If you're a pro-choice healthcare worker, you have to perform abortions, and Americans will pay for abortions here and abroad. That's where so I think where the country is, not what the proposal was yesterday in Kansas. Where the country is something like 15 weeks, something reasonable as far as you can't have abortion after that. But you do have exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I think we all have to be compassionate about what these women are going through. We all do cherish life in this country. We want more babies coming into the world, and we just want to cherish them and hold them and help them.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, as you say, the country is pro-life, but it's up to a point, right? Because the polling I've seen suggests that something like 2/3 of the country doesn't think you should absolutely ban all abortions. Do you agree with that?
Right. Absolutely. I think we ought to have reasonable restrictions. And I think probably, like Europe, most of Europe, I think is at 12 weeks. And so I think where people are in this country is probably 15 weeks, but you ought to have exceptions. Life, the mother, rape, and incest. And that's not what the vote was. That's not what that bill was about yesterday in Kansas. And I think that's what, I think Republicans have to be compassionate what these women are going through. And we got to do everything we can to make sure we cherish these little babies.
Okay, Senator, it's always great to talk to you. I hope sometime you get a vacation this summer. We'll see, though. You got a lot of work left to do. That's Republican Senator Rick Scott from Florida. Still to come, we're going to talk about U.S. trade relations with China in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan with Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
This week, will we see the first cracks in the labor market?
There's another shoe out there to drop.
Will the labor economy break?
Can the Fed deflate the demand for labor in the economy without pushing up unemployment?
This Friday, Tom, John, Lisa, and Mike will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
We still have a lot of slack in the labor market.
The labor market is going to be seen as to whether it keeps the light green. on go, go, go for this Fed.
The July Jobs Report, Friday on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. There's a fair amount of action in the markets right now, and for that we turn to Kriti Gupta. So Kriti, first of all, starting with equities up.
Up and up big. The NASDAQ really outperforming here. Tech out in front, up about 2%. If you look at the S&P 500, up only 1.3%. And I think this is the cherry on top of a pretty good Sunday for the stock market, which is it's coming on heavy volume as well. That is conviction buying. That is a good sign when it comes to whether or not this is actually a sustainable rally. You want to make sure that this isn't on light volume, especially in the fact that we're in summer trading. It's August. This is supposed to be a little quiet, but on a 5-day basis, the volume is up about 29%. I would argue, though, all the action is in the bond market, where you do see these massive moves. Yesterday, we saw an 18 basis point move in the 10-year yield alone, David. That was the second biggest move since the COVID-19 pandemic onslaught of March 2020. And the first biggest before that was on June 13th when we had the Fed kind of leak out the 75 basis points move that they were going to then do in June. So you saw the market reprice. So I would argue that once again, the market is trying to reprice a very hawkish Federal Reserve.
Well, that's the question, though. Reprice off of what? Is this Bullard talk? Is it daily talk after Powell talk last week? Is this all Fed speak? Is that what we're doing?
It kind of seems like it. I would argue that there is a geopolitical component to it as well, because you did see some of those initial moves yesterday amplified by the Fed speak. But the initial moves, I would say, came off of the Nancy Pelosi concerns around Taiwan and any kind of backlash that would happen on the chip sector. Remember, the chips scrutiny and the chips tightness that you have in the supply space feeds directly into inflation. If you're worried that that supply chain issue is going to get worse for any reason, that's really where you're going to see the pain. It's going to show up in the bond market. I think that perhaps was the start of the yield story. And then you had, of course, speakers like Mester, Daly, Bullard all come out and say, well, we still want to go hard on inflation.
So take all that and factor in oil. Because that was a big headline today when OPEC Plus came out and said, okay, we're going to increase production by a whole 100,000 barrels a day. Most people thought that was not very much. What's going on with oil?
Well, it wasn't very much. And you actually saw a massive spike off those headlines. The idea that the OPEC would perhaps amp up more of their output. It's something that President Biden was very vocal about, saying that he expects Saudi Arabia specifically to push for that. So 100,000 barrel increase is not that much. In fact, I believe it's the lowest in quite some time. So you did see an increase. And then you saw some inventory data, which completely turned the oil story around, saying that there's a lot of inventory data in the pile right now as well when it comes to oil barrels. And on top of that, you have the issue of spare capacity. I think that was the key part of this OPEC meeting. They said, we're not increasing by more because we can't, and we have to be a little bit more judicious, a little bit more cautious in exercising that and tapping into that spare capacity.
That was a real tour of the markets. Well done, Kriti. Okay, that's Kriti Gupta. You can catch more of Kriti at 1 p.m. Eastern Time when she'll be an anchor on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, are U.S. trade relations with China on hold after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taipei? We'll ask Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, the first grain shipment to sail from Ukraine's port since Russia's invasion has passed an inspection and will continue on its way to Lebanon. The vessel is loaded with more than 26,000 tons of corn. Ukraine has laid out plans to cautiously ramp up grain exports after the first ship sailed, but says the first 2 weeks will be treated as a trial period. President Biden will sign a second executive order today aimed at improving access to abortion services after the Supreme Court allowed states to largely put them off limits. The order will direct the government to reconsider ways to help patients travel outside their states for abortions. The order comes a day after voters in Kansas rejected an amendment that would have overturned abortion rights. The Senate Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on election security following the violent aftermath to the 2020 presidential vote. The Justice Department has reviewed more than 1,000 threatening messages to local election workers. 5 people are facing charges. The DOJ says it won't tolerate criminal intimidation of those who safeguard the U.S. electoral system. Germany is bracing for an expected spike in COVID-19 cases this coming fall and winter. The government unveiled new measures today, including mandatory masks on planes and long-distance train and bus rides, beginning in October. Officials say other rules may be implemented depending on how severely the virus spreads. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has left Taiwan now to continue her Asian tour, to go to South Korea and then to Japan. But the ramifications continue, including with China announcing some live fire operations around the island of Taiwan over there. To get a sense of what this might mean for trade relations in the area, we turn now to Wendy Cutler. She is Vice President of the Asia Society and former acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. So, Wendy, thanks for being here. What about the trade implications? You and I talked earlier about the prospects of lifting some of those so-called Trump tariffs on goods with China. Are those on hold?
I have to believe they're on hold now. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for the administration to do anything that could be interpreted as being soft on China, such as lifting tariffs.
So what could get things back on track from your perspective? I mean, as far as we know, President Biden is still looking to meet with President Xi.
Right. I mean, they did, just talk on the telephone about a week ago now, but so much has happened over the past week. The administration is carefully looking at China's responses to the Pelosi visit, which not only include these military live fire exercises, but also now have spread to what we call economic coercion, where China is imposing restrictions on imports of Taiwan food, fish, fruit, exports of sand. And so I think, the administration will watch these measures closely and see how it should respond. Just in the past couple of hours, the G7, which includes not only United States, Japan, but also Europe and Canada, issued a statement urging for stability and calm in the Taiwan Straits, and also expressing concern about the military actions by China, as well as the economic coercive measures that they're taking.
Do you have a sense, Wendy, from your understanding of it, how damaging this would be the Taiwanese economy, or is this more of a gesture on China's part?
It's too early to tell. In terms of the percentage of trade that the trade restrictive measures that China's imposed comprise, it's a very small percentage of Taiwan trade. But also these military exercises, from what I understand, can constitute kind of the de facto blockade of the sea lanes, which, facilitate exports and imports for the next 3 days. And, one thing we have to keep in mind as well, it's not just the actions that are taken in the next 24 hours. I think what is of concern going forward is we can witness escalatory actions both on the economic as well as the military front in the days and weeks ahead.
So one of my questions, Wendy, is what ramifications might this have for the region more generally? It's not just U.S. and China. We have Japan, we have South Korea, we have the Philippines, we have quite a few other trading partners over there. And I wonder what message they took away from the speaker's visit. Let's listen to what Speaker Pelosi said she thought she was accomplishing by going to Taiwan.
Now more than ever, America's solidarity with Taiwan is crucial. And that is the message we are bringing here. Our delegation, of which I'm very proud, came to Taiwan to make unequivocally clear we will not abandon our commitment to Taiwan, and we are proud of our enduring friendship.
Wendy, how does this fit in, if it does, to the larger plan of the Biden administration? Remember that when they went over there, they said we want to have the Indo-Pacific economic framework where we really build relations with a lot of our allies in the region. Does this help? Does this hurt? Or is this to the side of it?
I think for now it's to the side of it. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework talks are proceeding, and there will be a ministers' meeting in about a month from now to launch the negotiations. But I think more broadly, it's just going to create anxiety and uncertainty to the global economy and to the regional economy at a time when, there's so much uncertainty and anxiety due to the Ukraine war, supply chain disruptions, China's slow growth, and food security matters. And so I think we're going to all have to see how the next days and months unfold, weeks and months unfold. But clearly, the events over the past 24 hours, and I think in the coming 72 hours, are exactly not what the global economy needs right now, or, the global community.
What could we do that the global economy could make use of, and particularly with respect to some of the trading relations over in that part of the world? It doesn't look like the Biden administration is a big fan of long-term trade agreements, but are there agreements that we could enter into with some of the countries over there that could really buttress the relations?
Well, I think as a result of Speaker Pelosi's trip, we're going to see a big push in Congress to urge the administration to strengthen economic ties with Taiwan and to kind of have their backs and help them through this Chinese economic coercion. Again, I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework talks launched by the Biden administration will continue, and really the administration's answer to economic engagement and leadership in the region.
And to come back to China again, because it is such a large factor in the world economy, can you see a constructive path forward now? I know it's more complicated after Speaker Pelosi went over there. A more constructive path to try to get on some sort of a steady policy footing when it comes to trade with China?
More broadly, I think at least going into the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping wants stability in the relationship, in the globe, and in the region. And so I would hope that there will be, and there is, communication going on between Beijing and Washington to ensure that what's going on in the region right now doesn't escalate in an ugly way.
Okay, Wendy, it's always great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That's Wendy Cutler. She's Vice President of the Asia Society. Coming up, OPEC Plus responds to President Biden's request for more oil. Should the president be disappointed with that response? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, last month, we remember President Biden traveled to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to talk to Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. And part of that, at least, was to suggest that maybe they might want to start pumping some more oil. Well, we got a response today from OPEC Plus, in which they increased their limit by a whopping 100,000 barrels. Some people thought that was too little. To get his take on what's going on, we turn now to our resident expert on oil. He runs our oil research department for BNEF, and he is David Doherty. David, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us about the significance of this move, if any.
Yeah, if any is probably the most relevant part of that. 100,000 barrels per day is about the same amount of oil as Puerto Rico consumes. So it's a non-event in the oil market, and I think prices today sort of showed that too.
Now, I saw, David, yesterday there was a report on the Bloomberg, quite apart from the OPEC Plus, that in fact Saudi Arabia has ramped up their production recently. It's really up quite substantially. It's something like 7.5 million barrels a day or something like that. Is it possible that President Biden might have gotten his way, but not through OPEC Plus?
Yeah, it's important to put it into context what OPEC Plus has been saying over the last couple of months. They've had a self-set target of production that they've missed every single month this year. And in June, that was about 3 million barrels per day below their self-set target. Now, good news is that they have been limiting that gap. So they've been producing more, not hitting their target. But with Libya coming back, resilience from Russian production, and increases in some of the stable producers like the UAE and Saudi, there is actually more oil coming onto the market. So it's not all bad news in terms of supply.
David, as you know, there's a man named Amos Hochstein who works at the State Department as a senior advisor on energy security. And we talked to him earlier today about the reaction from the White House, whether they should be disappointed. And this is what he said.
We are calling on, whether it's OPEC or it's here at home, to increase production when possible and at the degree that is necessary to keep these prices coming down. This is not focused on OPEC. This is a global issue. They do have the capacity to increase. There's no doubt about that. We will continue to have the same message, whether it's a sovereign or if it's a private company.
So, David, a couple of interesting things there. First of all, his point, they do have the capacity to increase production. Do they, and how much do they have of it?
Yep. On the OPEC side, the UAE and Saudi alone have about 2 million barrels per day of capacity. OPEC in general is producing about 29 million barrels per day. They have, in 2016, 2017, produced about 33 million barrels per day. So plenty of room there in terms of upside. There's big problems and big thorns in their side, like Nigeria and Angola. But OPEC has got capacity to bring online. The question then turns to US producers and how fast and how much they can ramp up production. And then it's a real tightness in terms of how do you get that out of the ground in the US and how quickly. And then you have to look at things like the labor market. It's incredibly expensive to get even a truck driver in the US. Midland has really high inflation, amongst the highest levels in the US. So it's not for the want of trying, but it's incredibly expensive to get staffing and to get the equipment needed in the places in the US to ramp up that production on time. And that's the key part. It's on time that we need this production.
And David, that takes us to the other part that I heard Mr. Hochstein say, which is it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's also domestic private production. From your analysis, your understanding of this, how much of this is government policy? Because often in the oil industry here in the United States, people say, well, it's government policy that's keeping us from doing it. And how much of it is other factors?
Yeah, well, the US is fairly unique in that the vast majority of production comes from independent or smaller players. So they do face policy pressure and political pressure, but ultimately, you know, they answer to their shareholders, and we've seen them spending their money on paying down debt in the last couple of years and not turning on the taps just because prices have been higher. I mean, they were burned before, and they have pressure from their banks and their shareholders to pay down some of those high debt levels. So we've heard this sort of saber rattling again and again from policymakers in the US, but the reaction has been pretty muted, I would say, from US producers, and they seem to be holding that line.
And finally, David, you mentioned earlier Russian resilience, I think you called it, in production and sales. Where is Russia in this mosaic right now? And if, in fact, there could be an agreement on this so-called cap of capping the price, would it make a material difference to Russia?
I mean, a cap on price could make a material difference. What's interesting about Russia is it has seen a drop in production and a drop in exports to market. And you'll hear politicians say, you know, sanctions are working, there's huge discounts on Russian crude. Ultimately, though, Russia is getting more revenue from its oil and for less barrels than it did before the invasion of Ukraine. So, you know, these have had a massively muted impact. And that's why we're seeing these price cap whispers coming into play. How that actually falls and how that comes about, you know, it's very grey. Nobody's really explained how that would work. You'd need the buy-in of the biggest consumers and the biggest new buyers in particular of Russian oil, and that's India and China as well. So yeah, Russia hasn't really, I would say, taken the hit that was intended from these sanctions, and they're getting more money for less exports of oil ultimately.
It's a great point. It doesn't make sense to talk about that cap without talking about China and India as a practical matter. Thank you so much to David Doherty. He's our colleague at BNEF, who really covers oil research. Coming up, we go through yesterday's midterm results with Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, we had elections in 5 states, primary elections for the upcoming midterms. And to take us through them, we turn now to Washington correspondent Joe Matthew, host of Sound On every day of the week on Bloomberg Radio at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Joe, thanks for being here. Let me start with my home state of Michigan. We had a number of interesting things, including 2 Democrats fighting with each other because of redistricting, but also some consequences for anybody who voted for impeachment who was a Republican.
Well, isn't that right? It's hard to not look at last night's results through the Trump prism once again. I know this has been a bit of a trend over the course of primary season, and that remains the case. Last night, 3 Republican House members who voted to impeach Donald Trump were on the ballot. 2 of them in Washington state have yet to be called. But to your point, in Michigan, not a good result for Peter Meijer, freshman congressman. He lost to John Gibbs, the Trump-picked candidate who was actually propped up by Democrats. You know, we've seen this a couple of times, Democrats investing in ads to help him, at least indirectly, because they believe he might be easier to beat in the general. The 2 incumbents you mentioned, both of whom appear on this broadcast from time to time, was a very bitter contest between 2 former allies. Haley Stevens won the race against Andy Levin. That's the result of a redrawn map and a loss of 1 seat for Democrats, David.
And she had a little help from the outside, didn't she?
Yes, that's for sure. This actually became a very expensive race, considering the fact that it was a House district, and Democrats knew that they were going to be losing this. Some public interest groups poured an enormous amount of money into that contest. Arizona is really worth looking at. I don't know if you've had a chance to dig through these results either, David, but this was definitely a good night for Trump in Arizona.
And Peter Thiel, right?
Peter Thiel, how true.
So tell us about Blake Masters.
Blake Masters is going to be running against Senator Kelly. He won the Republican Senate primary, backed by Peter Thiel, of course, and backed by Donald Trump, a pretty formidable candidate there. He won by a long shot, and he was expected to win by a good 18, 20 points, as he did. As you look down ballot, though, some really interesting races here beyond the governor's race that I'll mention in a moment. Trump-endorsed candidate and election denier is now the head of the election system there, Secretary of State, or won the primary for such. Mark Fincham is his name. He could become the top elections official in Arizona, which is something that has some Democrats and Republicans concerned. Also, Rusty Bowers, remember him from the January 6th committee, the Speaker of the House in Arizona? He was actually trying to vie for an open state Senate seat, and he lost that race, not on the right side of Trump. The gubernatorial contest, though, is still up in the air. Carrie Lake, former TV anchor, endorsed by Trump, claimed victory last night, David, even though she was really not ahead. Basically a statistical tie with Karen Robson, who was endorsed by Mike Pence. That's a proxy battle between Trump and Pence, one that has yet to be decided and one we're looking at very closely.
Yeah, I don't know, Joe. There might be some correlation between Trump endorsements and people who've been on television a lot. Maybe there's a future there. I also have in Michigan the gubernatorial. But take us back to the Senate race in Arizona. Mark Kelly against Blake Masters. Do we have a sense of who's ahead?
Well, listen, it's difficult to tell and kind of trust polling right now. Mark Kelly is considered to be severely endangered, though, as a Democrat. That is a seat that Republicans are vying for and think they can pick up. That's going to be one of the races that helps to decide the balance of power in the Senate. Missouri was also in play last night. Did you hear about the Erics? David, did you hear Eric won?
And also got endorsed by Donald Trump, right? We're just not sure which Eric.
That's right. Eric Greitens, the former governor who actually left that seat early and was accused of sexual harassment. You might know him from the rhino hunting ad that he put together, where he's walking down the street with an assault-style weapon looking for rhinos. He lost the race to Eric Schmidt, the attorney general. Both of them love Trump. Both of them were election deniers. But they never got an endorsement until the night before. Donald Trump was pressed to say something, and he endorsed Eric without a last name. Last night, you'd like this, David, Donald Trump congratulated Eric. He said, "Great going. Big night, Eric," in quotes. Thank you. We just don't know which Eric.
You can't make it up. So, Joe, put all this together. Does it tell us anything, do you think, about the Senate balance?
That's a tough question to ask right now. Democrats think that they can hold the Senate, and either way, it's going to be within a couple of seats. Blake Masters could be a formidable candidate. If you're looking at Arizona, that's going to be a tough race. But if you talk to a lot of experts, they see the Senate as a draw right now. The House remains a very different prospect. Although after that result in Kansas that we saw last night, where we started this hour, the abortion vote, drew such enormous turnout in Kansas that a lot of folks are wondering if they're actually gauging the electorate in the right way following the Supreme Court ruling on Roe. Some 70% of voters who registered in Kansas after the Supreme Court ruling were Democrats.
I'm so glad you brought us back to that Kansas election, because it really is pretty remarkable. And it does, I don't want to engage in identity politics, but it does raise a question whether that so-called suburban woman is back in play.
It's certainly in play. It's just a question of which direction it's going to go. It's such a divisive issue that Democrats and Republicans know that a lot of races will be decided within that demographic, and it's one that you're going to hear a lot of deliberate language when in terms of advertising and placement of money in the next couple of months. Now that we saw that result last night, as I said a little while ago, we need to figure out if that's a bellwether for the nation or a story about very effective organizing in Kansas, whether that can be duplicated in other states.
And you're going to help us figure that out. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. Catch him at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on SoundOn on Bloomberg Radio. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter also on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. We hope you'll join us there. And this is Balance of Power. on Bloomberg.